Imagine this scene. A quiet boardroom in Washington, D.C., a group of Costco executives sit with U.S. trade officials, papers in hand, smiles on their faces. They believe they have locked Africa into yet another century of dependency. They believe $1.2 billion is enough to buy the soul of Burkina Faso, enough to put its farms, its markets, its people under Western control. They are already celebrating. They are already drafting press releases, imagining headlines. Costco expands into Africa. New deal seals U.S. dominance in food supply chains. But then something happened they never imagined. Captain Ibrahim, the young, unshakable leader of Burkina Faso, stood before the cameras, looked straight into the eyes of the world, and said a word that sent shockwaves through Washington, through Wall Street, through every corporate boardroom that thought Africa was still for sale. That word was, no to Costco's $1.2 billion deal. No to Western corporations owning Africa's food. No to dependency disguised as development. Didn't he just say no? He tore up the script the West had written for Africa for decades. He shattered their illusion that Africa would always remain the marketplace of others. He broke their chains with a single rejection, and what happened next? That no turned into the most powerful yes Africa has spoken in generations. Because was not simply rejecting, he was building. He was not turning away from the world, he was turning toward Africa. Instead of Costco's shelves filled with foreign goods, he unveiled a vision of African-owned markets, African supply chains, and African distribution hubs. Instead of farmers trapped in poverty, he envisioned farmers as stakeholders, cooperatives, and partners. Instead of young people working for pennies under foreign logos, he envisioned a generation managing their own warehouses, their own logistics, their own brands. The U.S. was furious. The Western media went into overdrive, calling him reckless, calling him authoritarian, calling him dangerous. But beneath their accusations was fear that their grip on Africa's markets was slipping, fear that their corporations would lose their monopoly, fear that a continent they once thought powerless was daring to stand tall. And then came the shocker. Didn't run to Washington or Paris. He didn't beg for aid from the IMF or the World Bank. Instead, he turned to Africa, to India, to Russia, to China, to Turkey. He built a coalition not of dependency but of dignity. Burkina Faso began erecting its own warehouses, opening its own trade routes, processing its own goods. The very system the U.S. thought it controlled was collapsing before their eyes. Washington had believed that with $1.2 billion they could own Burkina Faso. Instead, used that rejection to ignite a movement across the continent. Ghana began questioning foreign supermarket chains. Nigeria's youth started demanding food sovereignty. Kenya debated local supply chains. Across Africa, the chant rose louder. No to Costco, yes to sovereignty. Friends, this is not about one deal. This is about the soul of Africa. For too long, corporations dictated our diets, our prices, our markets. For too long, we supplied raw goods and bought back finished products at 10 times the price. For too long, sovereignty was stolen and sold cheap. But now, one leader has dared to break the cycle. One leader has dared to say, we are not for sale. This is why the U.S. is panicking. This is why Washington trembles. They know what is at stake. If Burkina Faso succeeds, the Costco rejection will not just be a national story, it will be the beginning of a continental revolution, and that terrifies them. So today, let us dive deep. Let us peel back the layers of this $1.2 billion. Rejection. Let us understand why the U.S. thought it could buy Burkina Faso, why said no, and what he built instead that is shaking the entire global order. Because this is not just Burkina Faso's story. This is Africa's story. This is the story of sovereignty reborn. This is the story of a continent telling the world, we are not beggars, we are builders. We are not for sale, we are sovereign. We are not weak, we are rising. Brothers and sisters, buckle up, because what you are about to hear is not just a speech, it is the sound of chains breaking. It is the sound of an empire trembling. It is the sound of Africa awakening. Brothers and sisters of Africa, children of our ancestors, I call upon you tonight not only as witnesses of history but as participants in the rebirth of a continent. For too long, Africa has been a story written by others. For too long, the ink has been spilled not from the hands of Africans but from the pens of Washington, Paris, London, and Brussels. For too long, our leaders were pushed into agreements dressed up as investments but in reality chains of dependency. But today, the winds of history are shifting. And at the center of this storm stands a young soldier, a patriot, a leader forged in the fire of resistance, Captain Ibrahim of Burkina Faso. His courage has begun to send tremors through the world, and the latest event has shocked the powerful beyond measure. For when America's retail giant Costco came with a glittering $1.2 billion deal, promising partnership, promising jobs, promising investment, did not bow, he did not kneel, he did not accept, he rejected it outright. And in that rejection lies a revolution far greater than the figure of money, far greater than a business contract. Let us peel back the layers. Why would any African leader, in a time when Western media paints Africa as desperate for investment, dare to reject a deal valued at over $1 billion? Why would he stand against an empire's economic machinery? Why would he risk angering Washington? The answer is simple yet profound, because understands history. He knows the hidden costs of Western partnerships. He knows that behind the glossy promises lies exploitation, behind the shining skyscrapers lies control, behind the dollars lies dependency. The Costco deal was framed as an opportunity to establish large-scale retail infrastructure across Burkina Faso and West Africa. They promised shopping centers, warehouses, distribution hubs, and supply chains that would modernize commerce in the region. They promised cheaper imports, greater access to goods, and jobs for the youth. On the surface, it sounded irresistible. On the surface, it looked like progress, but looked deeper. He looked beyond the numbers, beyond the promises, beyond the headlines. He asked, who truly benefits? Would Burkina Faso's farmers benefit when Costco filled its warehouses with American grain, American meat, American milk powder, flooding the markets and bankrupting local producers? Would the nation's entrepreneurs benefit when their small shops, markets, and businesses were crushed under the weight of a global retail giant? Would the state benefit when the profits were repatriated to Seattle and Wall Street, not reinvested in Burkina Faso? Would the sovereignty of the people remain intact when their food supply, their economy, their very commerce, was controlled by a foreign corporation backed by the U.S. government? The answer was clear. This was not a $1.2 billion gift. This was a Trojan horse. And so, said no in a world where too many leaders have been quick to sign, quick to bow, quick to trade sovereignty for comfort. His refusal was like thunder. The West was stunned. Washington could not believe it. Their lobbyists, their diplomats, their media all prepared themselves to announce another victory, another African market absorbed into the machinery of global capitalism. Instead, they were faced with a young African leader who stood up and declared, "We are not for sale. Our sovereignty is not for negotiation. Burkina Faso belongs to Africans, not to Costco, not to Washington, not to Paris." This rejection was not merely economic, it was symbolic. It was a declaration of independence in the 21st century. It echoed the spirit of Thomas Sankara, who declared that he who feeds you controls you. It reminded the world of Patrice Lumumba, who stood against the West's theft of Congolese resources. It revived the courage of Nkrumah, who called for African unity as the shield against exploitation. But what shook the world even more was not only the rejection itself, it was the calm confidence with which delivered it. He did not reject with bitterness or hatred, but with clarity and vision. He said, in effect, we do not reject America because we despise America. We reject this deal because it enslaves us. And we will build our own path with partners who respect us, with strategies that empower us, with courage that does not waver. The fury in Washington was immediate. Phone calls rang in Ouagadougou. Envoys demanded explanations. Threats were whispered about aid cuts, sanctions, and isolation. The Western press began spinning narratives. That was reckless, that he was anti-business, that he was sabotaging his own people. But none of it shook him. He stood firm because he understood something the West could not comprehend, that dignity is priceless, that sovereignty cannot be traded, that Africa is waking up and will not be lulled back to sleep. Yet, brothers and sisters, this is only half the story, for the rejection of the Costco deal was not just a defensive act. It was not only about saying no to the West. It was also about saying yes to a new vision of Africa, to a new direction, to a future where Africans no longer beg at foreign tables but build their own. This rejection set the stage for what came next, and what came next shocked the world. But before we move to that revelation, let us dwell for a moment on the magnitude of what has already happened. Consider the history of American corporate expansion in Africa, from oil companies to fast food chains, from agribusiness giants to retail monopolies. The U.S. strategy has always been the same. Identify a market, secure government support, enter with billions, crush local competition, and create dependency. Once entrenched, these corporations become too big to regulate, too essential to challenge, too connected to remove. They then dictate policy, manipulate economies, and keep nations in a cycle of dependency disguised as modernization. Costco's $1.2 billion deal was a continuation of this strategy. It was not about helping Burkina Faso, it was about controlling West Africa's consumer market. And once control of food and goods is secured, political control follows. For he who controls the stomach controls the nation. He who controls distribution controls power. Understood this, and by rejecting the deal, he prevented the first domino from falling. But the rejection did more than block exploitation. It inspired, across Africa, youth watched Ina as a leader dared to do what many thought impossible. Social media lit up with voices celebrating Burkina Faso's courage. Students in Ghana debated what it would mean for their nation to do the same. Workers in Nigeria asked why their leaders still signed such deals. Farmers in Kenya wondered what sovereignty might look like if their markets were protected. One act of defiance in Ouagadougou sent ripples across the continent, awakening a spirit long buried under decades of dependency, and the world beyond Africa took notice. In Beijing, in Moscow, in Ankara, in New Delhi, policymakers studied S decision with admiration. Here was a leader willing to break ranks, willing to say no to Washington, willing to chart an independent path. They knew that if Burkina Faso succeeded, others would follow and the global balance of power would tilt. Friends, we stand at the edge of a new chapter in African history. The rejection of the Costco deal is not the end of the story, it is the beginning. What did next? How he transformed rejection into construction, how he turned down dependency and built sovereignty. That is the part that shocked the world. And in part 2 of this great story, we shall see not just the act of defiance, but the act of creation. For it is one thing to say no to oppression. It is another to say yes to liberation. And that yes, that vision, that blueprint for a new Africa, is what followed. Brothers and sisters, the rejection of America's Costco deal was only the opening act. The world thought would simply slam the door and retreat into isolation, that Burkina Faso would stand defiant but alone. Yet what he did next shook capitals across the globe. He did not reject to sulk. He rejected to build. He rejected because he had already envisioned an alternative, and that alternative carried within it the seeds of an African renaissance. The very day after rejecting the $1.2 billion Costco offer, convened his cabinet, his economic advisors, his military council, and most importantly, representatives of farmers, traders, students, and workers. He said, if we say no to dependency, we must say yes to sovereignty. If we refuse the handcuffs of Costco, we must forge tools of our own. The message was clear. Burkina Faso would not reject just to resist, it would reject to create, to innovate, to lead. So what did do? He launched a bold initiative called Food Sovereignty First. Instead of accepting Costco's warehouses filled with imported goods, Burkina Faso began constructing its own state-of-the-art distribution hubs, owned by the people, supplied by African farmers, and managed with transparent systems, instead of letting a foreign corporation dictate prices. Established cooperatives that allowed farmers to sell directly into these hubs. Imagine it, farmers from villages across Burkina Faso bringing their maize, sorghum, onions, millet, fruits, and vegetables into national warehouses, receiving fair prices guaranteed by the state and watching their produce delivered not to foreign ports but to local markets, schools, and hospitals. In place of Costco's promise of jobs, which would have been low-wage, exploitative, and dependent, Burkina Faso's initiative created tens of thousands of meaningful jobs. Builders constructed the hubs. Farmers expanded production. Youth trained in logistics, management, and modern agricultural technology. Truckers, vendors, and market women found themselves at the heart of a system that valued them rather than replaced them. The second part of S plan was even more audacious. Instead of using American loans or IMF funding, he financed the program through a partnership of African solidarity. Mali contributed logistic support. Niger provided access to energy resources. Guinea and Ghana offered investment in processing equipment. Soon, whispers began that an African supply chain alliance was being born, a Pan-African alternative to Western retail dominance. This was no longer about Burkina Faso alone. It was about a region declaring independence from corporate colonization. Washington panicked. Their media headlines screamed, Burkina Faso turns to self-reliance. Builds alternative to U.S. giants, West losing influence in Africa's markets. Think tanks warned that if Burkina Faso's plan succeeded, American companies would be locked out of Africa's fastest-growing consumer markets. They knew what was at stake. Africa's population is projected to double by 2050. Whoever controls Africa's markets controls the future of global consumption, and Burkina Faso had just slammed the door in Washington's face, but was not done. The third blow came when he announced that Burkina Faso would not only distribute African goods, but also process and brand them for export. Instead of shipping raw mangoes to Europe, Burkina Faso began building mango drying and packaging plants. Instead of exporting raw cashews, they began building factories to shell, roast, and package them. Instead of sending cotton abroad, Burkina Faso began constructing textile mills to produce clothing stamped made in Burkina Faso. This was the part that truly shocked the world, because in rejecting Costco, was not just refusing foreign dominance, he was challenging the entire model of Africa as a raw material supplier. He was building a model where Africa controlled not just the soil but the shelves, not just the farms but the factories, not just the fields but the future. The Western reaction was predictable and desperate. Threats of sanctions flew, aid was suspended, rumors of covert operations spread, Western media accused of being authoritarian, of closing Burkina Faso off from the world, of aligning with dangerous powers. But the more they attacked, the more the African people rallied. Across West Africa, chants of no to Costco, yes to sovereignty, echoed in the streets. Young people who had grown tired of seeing their nations humiliated found in a symbol of courage, and as the West panicked, new allies emerged. India offered to share technology for food storage and processing. Turkey pledged to build logistics centers. Russia proposed to provide energy infrastructure at discounted rates. China committed to financing regional railways that would connect Burkina Faso's new trade hubs to ports and neighboring markets. What Washington called isolation quickly became integration, but on Africa's terms, not the West's. Friends, do you see the brilliance? Had turned a rejection into a rebirth. He had turned down $1.2 billion because he understood that the true cost of that money was sovereignty. And instead, he built a system worth far more not just in dollars, but in dignity. The ripple effect has been staggering. In Ghana, farmers began demanding that their leaders reject similar deals with foreign supermarkets. In Nigeria, youth organizations rallied for food sovereignty. In Kenya, debates raged in parliament about building local supply chains across Africa. This decision ignited conversations not about aid, not about dependency, but about ownership, pride, and vision. But let us not be naive. The path is not without obstacles. Western corporations will not give up their grip easily. Already, they are lowering prices to flood markets, hoping to bankrupt Burkina Faso's cooperatives. Already, NGOs funded by foreign donors are launching campaigns painting the initiative as unsustainable. Already, whispers of coups and destabilization are spreading. This is the oldest playbook of empire. If you cannot buy sovereignty, destabilize it. If you cannot own it, destroy it. Yet, as leadership remains steadfast. He has declared that Burkina Faso will defend its sovereignty at all costs, not only with weapons but with unity, discipline, and vision. We will not be fooled, he said in a recent address. We will not trade our future for crumbs. We will not bow to threats. We will stand. And if we stand, Africa stands. And now, brothers and sisters, let us draw to the conclusion of this chapter. What does it mean, truly, that rejected Costco's $1.2 billion deal? It means that Africa has found the courage to say no not just to one corporation, but to an entire system of exploitation. It means that sovereignty is not an abstract slogan but a living choice, a daily act of resistance. It means that Africa has leaders who understand that dignity cannot be bought, that the future cannot be outsourced, that independence must be lived, not begged for. This rejection is more than an economic decision. It is a manifesto. It declares to the world that Africa will not be the supermarket of the West, the dumping ground of surplus, the playground of corporations. It declares that Africa will feed itself, clothe itself, build for itself. It declares that the time of dependency is over and the time of sovereignty has begun. The world is shocked. Washington is furious. Paris is trembling. Corporations are panicking, but Africa smiles, because Africa knows that when one nation stands, others will follow. When Burkina Faso says no, Africa begins to whisper no, and soon, that whisper will become a roar. And when that roar echoes across the deserts of the Sahara, across the forests of the Congo, across the mountains of Ethiopia, across the coasts of Senegal, then the world will know Africa has awakened. Africa has broken its chains. Africa is no longer begging. Africa is building. So let us stand with Burkina Faso. Let us stand with every farmer, every student, every worker, every soldier who believes in an Africa sovereign, free, and united. For the rejection of Costco is not just the rejection of a deal, it is the rejection of a destiny written by others. And in its place, Africa writes its own. The choice has been made. The path is clear. The future is ours.